What is going on, everybody? Welcome to the Cleveland Browns Tailgate Show. I'd like to thank you guys for coming out again. Sorry for the late start. Had some slight technical difficulties with getting the stream started, but we are here. We are ready, and it is Thursday night football. I hope you guys are ready. I'm excited. It's going to be a great show. As you guys know, the Cleveland Browns are taking on the Cincinnati Bengals for the Battle of Ohio. The Cleveland Browns are finally looking for some redemption after their loss last week to the Baltimore Ravens. It was a straight pounding, 38-6. Obviously, Baker Mayfield, Odell Beckham, head coach Kevin Stefanski are all looking to rewrite the narrative of this season and get things on a positive note. Now, as you guys all know, starting off the season 0-2 and 0-2 in the division is not a good start at all. And obviously, things need to turn around quickly and fast as possible. And I definitely believe that the Cleveland Browns, Kevin Stefanski, and staff will finally get things turned around. Now, once again, my name is Shawn Stevenson. As you can see in the top left and right-hand corners, these are my socials, SHWN Stevenson. Basically, my first name without the A and my last name included. I am a contributing writer for Sports Illustrated Browns Digest. I also work with lead editor Pete Smith and Brandon Little. You guys can check out Sports Illustrated Browns Digest at www.si.com/NFL/Browns. It is also streaming live on the Browns Maven. I know we are now Browns Digest on the Facebook page. We're also on YouTube and Twitter as well. So make sure you guys go ahead and give the feeds a share so all Browns fans can hop in this. We can get some discussion going. And just again, another just disclaimer that the Cleveland Browns Tailgate Show is not directly affiliated with the NFL or the Cleveland Browns franchise. This is more about having an open discussion with you guys, making sure that you know all the important information ahead of the matchup. And we're just going to go ahead and hop straight into it. So like I said, you guys already know this is going to be a huge matchup for the Cleveland Browns taking on the Cincinnati Bengals, another AFC North rival. We're going to be playing them obviously twice this season. This first matchup, nationally televised game. You have Joe Burrow, who was the number 1 overall pick in this year's draft, obviously a virtual draft back in April. And he actually had a strong outing against the Chargers last week. But again, they're going to be starting off 0-1, similar to the Browns were. And they're also trying to get off into a better start than they did last week. So we'll just talk about just slightly some important information. One, the injury report. If any of you guys have been keeping up to date and following what's been going on, you should know that the Browns and both the Bengals have been hurt by some injuries, no pun intended. Obviously, there's some things that they have to work on, but with any team, it's always the next man up mantra, and you have to do what's best for your team and making sure whatever players are there, you know, they're ready to play at their full ability, and that's all you really can ask for at this point. So going into the just the teams overall, again, the Cleveland Browns last season didn't have the greatest season, so they're looking to make a new narrative with the team. Obviously, last year, Week 17, the Bengals did win their last matchup, 33-23 in Week 17 in Cincinnati. Freddie Kitchens, that was his last game coaching last season. This offseason, they hired Kevin Stefanski and general manager Andrew Berry to turn around the staff. And now they have their season home opener at First Energy Stadium in Cleveland. It's a really relatively chilly day. As you guys know, as it gets later in the year in Cleveland, it does get colder, but there won't be any type of advantage, obviously, with the Cincinnati Bengals being from Ohio as well. And we all know about that Ohio weather. Just like they say, if you don't like the weather now, just wait an hour. So it's actually some decent weather today. Nothing in the forecast in terms of rain or any snow or anything like that. So it should be a relatively dry football game, which is also nice. And then again, just looking at the teams last year, the Cleveland Browns were the 12th best rushing attack when it came to pounding the ball. Obviously, that was led on the legs of Nick Chubb, who was second in the league, only behind Derrick Henry in rushing. And then obviously we have Kareem Hunt this season for all 16 games, forbidding any type of injuries or any type of miscues or anything like that. Also, the team's rushing. This is going to be something a little bit difficult with them, but on the opposite end for the Cincinnati Bengals, they weren't great at stopping the run either. The Cleveland Browns actually had the fifth worst rushing attempts. They were obviously averaging over 5 yards per carry, which is huge. And then you look at the Cincinnati Bengals, who had the worst rushing defense last year. They were averaging over 4.7 yards per carry. So that's definitely something that both teams are looking to improve on. But that's going to be a pretty difficult task when you look at the Cincinnati Bengals and who they'll be having out this week. Obviously, their team is changing over a lot as second-year head coach Zach Taylor has another year with his players outside of Joe Burrow and the incoming rookies to essentially develop his system. Obviously, he is a young offensive-minded coach, so you can expect them to do some creative things on offense, let Joe Burrow utilize his legs, his movement. He's a tough guy, a little bit similar to a mobile Ben Roethlisberger in terms of size and staying in the pocket and just being able to, take a few hits. And hopefully the Browns defense can actually get into the backfield, stop the running backs, and also collapse the pocket for Joe Burrow. So looking at this week's injury report, obviously injuries is never a thing that you want to see happen. But, excuse me, go ahead and find it. Here we go. So we're going to start off with the Cincinnati Bengals. The Cincinnati Bengals are going to be without defensive tackles Geno Atkins and Mike Daniels. Geno Atkins, as you guys all know, if you've ever watched any Bengals versus Browns games or just any AFC North, Geno Atkins has been a staple from Cincinnati, making it to multiple Pro Bowls, and he was obviously a menace in this middle of that defensive line. And then they also added Mike Daniels in free agency. So they were definitely making sure they were adding talent up front in order to prevent another porous run defensive season. But that's actually going to be a tough task for them, missing both those key players in the middle of that defensive line, with Geno Atkins out with the shoulder injury and Mike Daniels out with the groin injury. Now, also looking at the rest of their injury report, safety Shawn Williams is also out with a calf injury, and they also lost their starting offensive guard and Xavier Suafilo. He's going to be out with an ankle injury, and obviously that's going to be really big for them because now they have to have their center slide over, which is Billy Price from Ohio State. Now he will be playing right guard in his absence, with him now on IR. Now, looking at the Browns, obviously their injury report is slightly different. There actually will be no MJ Stewart on the injury report this week, but they're still really big on players being out in that secondary and in that linebacking group. Obviously, cornerback Greedy Williams is still going to be out with a shoulder injury. Kevin Johnson as well, the starting nickel, is also going to be out with that liver. And then you look at both linebackers, Mack Wilson and Jacob Phillips, both dealing with knee injuries. Hopefully, we can get those players back as soon as possible because later in the season, they will be important. But if you just look at these first 4 games of the season, obviously we're not going against too many super strong passing attacks. So hopefully, this week they'll be able to find some consistency and be able to stop the pass a little bit more consistent than they did last week. And then we have 6 players that were listed as questionable heading into this game. Starting off offensive tackle Jack Conklin, who was nursing an ankle and finger injury throughout practice this week. He had very limited participation. And then some days he didn't even practice early in the week. And then also offensive tackle Chris Hubbard is still nursing that ankle injury, but he is now listed as questionable. Offensive tackle Jedrick Wills, who had his first start of his rookie season, he's nursing a shin injury. Obviously, he did go out for a few snaps last week against the Baltimore Ravens. He's also listed as questionable. And then again, 4 out of 6 of those main offensive linemen for the Cleveland Browns are listed as questionable. Finally, with center J.C. Treader, who's been nursing a knee injury since training camp, but he did play all the offensive snaps last week against Baltimore. So obviously, we're wanting good help from them. Then you look at the defensive side of the ball. You have Olivier Vernon, who's nursing an abdomen injury. He's also listed as questionable. Didn't have the greatest outing last week against the Baltimore Ravens, so we're hoping that this injury doesn't hamper him in terms of his performance this week, because it is obviously going to be important for Vernon to be on the field, be able to be that anchor opposite of Myles Garrett, and provide some consistency, not only stopping the run, but also offering more of productivity in the pass rush. And then lastly, receiver Jarvis Landry, he's listed as questionable with the hip, but obviously he had the offseason surgery, and most likely he's going to go about 95% sure that he'll be playing this week. Now, again, this is the Cleveland Browns Tailgate Show, and what would a tailgate be without food? So we got to give you guys the tailgate recipe of the week. This one is going to be for all my dessert people. If you love chocolate, you're going to love this week's tailgate recipe. So let's hop straight into that. What's going on, Dog Pound? The tailgate recipe of the week is ultimate fudge brownies. And this one, I had to do it for all my dessert people. If you love chocolate or you got that sweet tooth craving, this recipe is for you. So let's not even waste any more time. Let's get straight into it. Here we go, brownies. Here we go. Hoo, hoo. So again, that is the tailgate recipe of the week. You guys can check that out on the Browns Mavens Facebook page, as well as Twitter. You know, during halftime, you guys get that sweet tooth after the Browns are pouncing on these Bengals. You go ahead and get you a nice sweet treat to celebrate the Browns' victory today. So let's go ahead and get straight into the depth chart. Cleveland Browns going to look very similar to last week with Baker Mayfield under center. We have running back Nick Chubb going to be that main workhorse today, along with Kareem Hunt and then Dearness Johnson as the third running back. You have Andy Janovich at fullback. You can expect a little bit more Andy Janovich this week. Obviously, David Njoku was just placed to IR, so that does open up some more opportunities to get Janovich on the field. And if you guys know and understand that Mike Daniels and Geno Atkins provide so much for the Bengals in their run defense, them not being available, you could expect a heavy dosage of Andy Janovich and providing more run blocking to open up more holes for Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. Now going to the receiver depth chart, obviously we have Odell Beckham Jr. He was the main headlines for a lot of talks for Browns players this week. Obviously, there was the rumors of Browns potentially shopping him, which weren't happening to be true. And then obviously Beckham himself just talking to the media. His biggest thing, even though he said it was only one thing, was he's focusing on winning and his production. And that's the one thing we need from Odell Beckham, is for him to produce. At the end of the day, you being a wide receiver in the NFL, it all comes down to production. If you can't produce at a high level, then it's difficult for someone to have such a high contract where they're paying two of the top 10 receivers on the team with him and Jarvis Landry, and Beckham is just not producing. As simple as that. Him and Baker Mayfield need to develop some chemistry, and I feel like this is a good opportunity for him this week, obviously going against a lesser opponent in the Cincinnati Bengals, but this will not be a cakewalk. The Cincinnati Bengals do have a relatively decent secondary. They performed relatively well against Mike Williams and Keenan Allen last week against the LA Chargers, and obviously they're going to take some of that confidence going into this week with Odell Beckham not having the greatest game last week. Now moving over to Jarvis Landry. Jarvis Landry has been the one consistency in this receiver group that we've wanted since we signed him back in 2017. Now, obviously, that's really 2018. That's really the biggest thing with him, is that he provides leadership, he provides consistency, and he's always been that security blanket that Baker Mayfield could throw the ball to and know he's going to come down with it. Big third down catches, converting first downs, always finding open areas in intermediate and middle parts of the field. Jarvis Landry should be the number one option when it comes to the passing game. Part of Kevin Stefanski's game plan this week really should be in just getting his players into open space. Everything doesn't have to be shots down the field. Find the soft spots of the area, work that play action, and then just make sure you get it to your star playmakers underneath. And then obviously when you're pounding the ball, the play action will help open things over top. Now, continuing down that depth chart, Kadero Hodge obviously has been that number 3 receiver, having more snaps than Rashard Higgins last week. Now, a lot of fans obviously love Rashard Higgins after that rookie season that he had with Baker Mayfield back in 2018, where they obviously had a really good chemistry when they won, 5 of their last 7 games towards the end of the season. And obviously they haven't been able to, replicate that chemistry just yet. But obviously the coaching staff finds something that they like in Kadero Hodge. Obviously he offers a lot in terms of special teams, but no matter who's that third receiver on the field, when they are in 11 personnel, that receiver can get open and make some simple plays and honestly just catch the ball. That's really what we need, is just someone to catch the ball, move the chains, and then make sure that the drives continue to move. And then wrapping up the rest of that receiver core, we have Donovan Peoples-Jones and JoJo Natson. Obviously, Donovan Peoples-Jones was inactive last week, most likely going to be inactive again this week. And I know he's a good player, but at the same time, you guys got to understand he's a 6th-round pick. There was no training camp, limited offseason reps for him. So obviously it's going to be a learning curve, and you want to ease a rookie into the game, obviously, if they're not the main part of your game plan. And you look at JoJo Natson, who's primarily going to be your main kick returner and punt returner for special teams. Now, looking at the tight end position, obviously this had a lot of discussion this week with David Njoku going to IR. Obviously, David Njoku, according to Pro Football Focus, he was the highest rated tight end, even higher than Mark Andrews, but obviously that goes based off the snaps that you're on the field. He only played 17 snaps last week, and David Njoku caught all 3 of his targets for 50 yards, had the second longest play of the game, and then he only scored the Browns 1 touchdown last week. So obviously we're going to need some production coming out of that tight end group. You look at Austin Hooper and you look at Harrison Bryant. These 2 players, simply, they have to step up. Obviously, with 2 targets each, that's really not a lot for them to go based off of in terms of, production that we're supposed to equate them to. But when you're playing Austin Hooper, with a $44 million contract, he has to produce. Obviously, 2 catches for 15 yards is not enough for a player that you made at that time the highest paid tight end. Obviously, George Kittle, Travis Kelce, those deals top that. But the biggest thing is just finding that production. Austin Hooper, obviously, it's not that player that's just going to be this world beater who's just going to dominate everyone down the seam, catch jump balls down the field and just stretch the field vertically. But he's someone that knows how to find the soft spot of the zone. He understands underneath coverage. Since, just like I said last week, since 2016, he leads the league from tight ends in production underneath and intermediate parts of the field by a wide margin. Understanding that, he needs to be Baker Mayfield's security blanket. If it's 3rd and 2, 3rd and 4, he needs to be at the sticks, and Baker Mayfield needs to make sure that he's looking at all his reads, going through his progressions, and finding Austin Hooper, because obviously with his time during Matt Ryan, he was able to be that player for him, and hopefully, developing that chemistry. They did work together during the offseason. He can provide some of that production and some of that security for Baker Mayfield. Now you look at Harrison Bryant, and Harrison Bryant, obviously the rookie, he won the John Mackey Award in college, and then also won the award for the Maurice Bassett Award for the best rookie during training camp. Obviously, he didn't have a lot of production either, with only 2 receptions. But again, it's just a matter of getting them the ball. If they can get the ball, make some catches, I definitely believe that this tight end group will have better production this week if things are able to open up more and they just find some consistency within the game plan that they have themselves. And then obviously Steven Carlson is going to move up to that third tight end spot with David Njoku now IR. And then lastly, just wrapping up for the rest of the depth chart for the offense, you look at the offensive line, who actually played a relatively decent game last week. I was thoroughly impressed with how many clean pockets Baker Mayfield did have. Obviously, it does come down to Baker Mayfield to trust his eyes and to trust that he's going to have a clean pocket where he can deliver a solid ball. And as long as he can do that, I definitely believe that, the offensive line will continue to build that chemistry to give him clean pockets to throw out of. So you look at the left tackle, Jedrick Wills, the 10th pick. He's going into his second game. And for the most part, I can say that he held his own against the Baltimore Ravens. Obviously, they have a very strong defensive front. Having Calais Campbell, who's just an absolute mammoth of a man. You look at Derek Wolfe, Pernell McPhee, Matthew Judon. So obviously, he was going to get some stalwarts on that defensive line and that linebacker rushing core that the Baltimore Ravens have. And he was, able to play relatively well. He did have a 63.2 offensive grade according to PFF last week, which is relatively average, but that's something you want to see from your offensive tackle. That's a rookie that's switching over from the right side where he played at Alabama over to Baker Mayfield's blind side on the left side of the offensive line. Then you move over to Joel Bitonio. Obviously, Joel Bitonio has been one of those stalwarts who's been super consistent on the Browns offensive line. He's been there. And obviously, he's one of those players that you can trust, both, protecting the interior with Baker Mayfield being a smaller quarterback. Obviously, protecting the interior is very important because if you can limit how much pressure is coming up the middle, it gives him the ability to scan from the pocket. But also on the same note, you look at Joel Bitonio, you look at J.C. Treader, Wyatt Teller. These players need to make sure, however they're maintaining their blocks, that they can limit how often that defensive linemen are able to knock down the ball at the line of scrimmage. Obviously, Calais Campbell did that at a very high rate last week. So we want to figure out ways, whether it's for Baker Mayfield to slide differently in the pocket, but them being able to communicate in between plays of how to avoid situations where passes are getting batted down at the line of scrimmage. Then you look at J.C. Treader, who comes into this game questionable again with a knee injury. I do believe that J.C. Treader is going to play most likely the full game. He showed relatively good health last week. He had a 74.0 overall grade, which is the eighth best grade for centers last week. And obviously, he's been relatively well in pass protection with the 77.6. And then you look at his backup, Nick Harris, who should be able to come in and provide some good, just go ahead and pull up the offensive line. Here we go, for Joel Bitonio. And then you have as well Wyatt Teller. Now, Wyatt Teller, he gets the biggest ups for this week by the fact that he had the highest grade of any offensive guard last week. Had the highest grade according to Pro Football Focus with a 91.2 grade. Obviously, his run blocking was something that was somewhat of a question heading into this season. He was a better pass blocker than he was a run blocker last year, but he showed improvement with a 91.6 run blocking grade, was the second best of all offensive guards last week. So we obviously want him to continue that trend against a weakened Cincinnati Bengals defensive line. And if he can do that and perform at a high level, this definitely makes it a good game for Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt in order for them to find running lanes. And then lastly, you look at Jack Conklin, who's also on the injury report. He had a 73.1 grade, relatively weak in run blocking, or average, I should say, with a 66 grade last week, and he's more of a stalwart in that run blocking game. Now, you can't feel confident with Jack Conklin with the last 2 years in Tennessee, having ran an outside zone scheme with Derrick Henry. So he obviously knows the scheme. He knows his blocking assignments. Obviously, that health is going to be important. That ankle injury is a little bit more worrisome than necessarily the finger. They can wrap it up, make it a club if necessary. But obviously, we're going to have high expectations for Jack Conklin, even though he did perform relatively well in the passing game with a 76.9 pass blocking grade. Now, looking at their backups, you have Kendall Lamb, who's going to be that swing tackle on the left side and a replacement for Jedrick Wills if he does have to come out at any point. And you have Nick Harris, the backup center, and then Evan Brown, who can play either guard position or center as a backup. And then obviously Chris Hubbard, who's also listed as questionable this week. So that's just wrapping up the Cleveland Browns offensive depth chart. I'm just going to go here and if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I can check them all out. So there's actually a quick question that we have from Ohio Sports Blog, Brandon Little, who's actually one of the contributing writers for Browns Digest over at Sports Illustrated. And he asked thoughts on the Browns and how they'll be able to compete with the Bengals dropping 5 wide receivers and then having, Kevin Johnson, Greedy Williams out for the defensive back position. Now, with this, it's going to be very important that the Browns are able to cover in space. Now, last week, they often had empty sets with the Bengals. Sometimes they had 5 receivers. They'll have 4 receivers and a tight end, or 3 receivers and 2 tight ends, but they had a lot of empty sets. where Joe Burrow could either spread the field, find open options. There was a lot of clear out routes where you have, 3 or 4 players running vertical and then someone coming underneath. It's going to be very important that the Browns secondary as a whole steps up. Now, understand there are some cornerbacks that's out, but put it plain and simple, Andrew Sendejo has to step up. Obviously, last week he was getting torched by Marquise Brown and Mark Andrews. We're hoping that he has a better game on that back end. He's a veteran player. Obviously, he's already played with Joe Woods, so there's the expectation of what your responsibilities are on the back end. So obviously, we hope that he can improve on that and play better on that back end. And you look at Carl Joseph, obviously Terrence Mitchell, Denzel Ward had relatively solid games last week. We just look for them to, make further improvements on that back end. But the biggest question mark, if the Bengals, or not even if, when the Bengals do decide to go on those empty sets or have 4 spread wide receivers, that Andrew Sendejo, can play better in that back end. And then also we have another question from Mark Bradley over on YouTube asking, what do you think is going to be the biggest key for the Browns to get the victory over the Bengals tonight? So, actually, we're going to save this one towards the back end of the video where I give the 3 keys to victory for the Browns, but this one's going to be easy. Run the ball. If you can't run the ball with Geno Atkins and Mike Daniels being out, there's obviously an issue, but, we can deal with that a little bit later. But running the ball is obviously going to be a key for the Browns this week. Now, going over to the defensive side of the ball, you look at Myles Garrett. Myles Garrett is a player that we paid a huge contract to, and we're expecting some big production from him this week. Obviously, last week, there were some opportunities where he was getting some pressure on Lamar Jackson, but he just couldn't finish the play. Now, obviously, we all know Myles Garrett is a generational franchise talent over on the edge, and we definitely want him to make that impact. We need him to essentially have an impact game similar to how he had last year. If you guys really look at this season, compared to last season, obviously there's different coaching staffs, but you just look at the performances for the season opener versus the next week. You look at the embarrassment which was the Tennessee Titans, and then you look at the dismantling that happened last week with the Baltimore Ravens. The following week, the Browns played better. You look at the New York Jets, when they played that primetime game. Odell Beckham had a big play, an 89-yard slant that he took for a touchdown. Then you look at Myles Garrett constantly hitting the quarterback. Obviously, it sucks that Trevor Siemian got hurt from one of the hits that he had, but he was constantly in the backfield causing pressure. We need one of those games. Excuse me, actually, sorry, guys, got to remove the comment. We need one of those games from Myles Garrett. He needs to get a sack. He needs to get, to the quarterback, cause some pressure for Joe Burrow. One, he's a rookie. He's on an extremely short week. Just playing on Sunday, playing a Thursday night game in prime time. Obviously, there's going to be fans in the stadium. This isn't going to be an empty stadium like it was in LA. And then you look at the Brown Stadium, there'll be 6,000 fans. So obviously, those 6,000 fans have to make some noise. And you're going to look at Joe Woods to provide some pressure, whether it be from blitzing, some stunt packages across the defensive line. But the key is to get pressure and making sure you're collapsing the pocket as much as possible, but also staying in your rushing lanes. If you look at last week, Joe Burrow didn't throw a touchdown, but he did have a 23-yard rushing touchdown. Again, in that 5-wide set, he audibled to a quarterback draw and ran for a touchdown. It's really important when you have a quarterback that is mobile like Joe Burrow in order to stay in your rushing lanes to prevent any of those big plays, from that position. Then you look at the rest of the defensive line. Obviously, you have Olivier Vernon. Last week, he did perform really well. Let's just keep it straightforward. His pro football focus grade was 48.3, which is the 90th ranked edge defender out of 112. That's not really good. Obviously, he was a little bit better in run defense, but his pass rush grade with a 46.3 just isn't enough. There's obviously been some questions since Olivier Vernon has come to the team about his production as an edge player in terms of pass rush, and he has to improve. It doesn't get any simpler than that. He obviously didn't perform to the standards that we were expecting when we traded for him, being across from Myles Garrett, having more one-on-one matchups. Now, I don't know if it's from just an age standpoint where he's getting towards the back end of his career, but we obviously have higher expectations for Olivier Vernon, and hopefully he can provide that starting this week, being able to get to the quarterback. Now, also, you look at Adrian Claiborne, who was a veteran signing this offseason. He's on a 1-year deal, or excuse me, 2-year deal. You look at him, and last week he had a 77.4 run defense grade. Again, that's great for him coming in as a rotational defensive end, but his calling has always been rushing the passer. You look at the game that he had against the Dallas Cowboys, where he had 6 sacks, and they just decided not to block him that game. Now, for the rest of the season, he was relatively quiet when it came to pass rushing productivity, but he's one of those players, once he gets going, the motor runs, and we're obviously expecting something like that from him. Obviously, you're not expecting double-digit sacks from a rotational defensive end, but you just want him to be a consistent collapser of the pocket, and as long as he can continue to have that high run defense grade, he'll be a good rotational defensive end along that defensive line that's going to be seeing 4 people in the front. And then you look at Porter Gustin and Joe Jackson as those other edge players that will be considered as rotational pieces. Now, going to the interior of the defensive line performed really, really well last week. Obviously, against that Ravens run attack, just sucks that they didn't provide much in terms of pass rush productivity. But then again, our secondary didn't really do much to help them either. You look at Larry Ogunjobi. Larry Ogunjobi, again, another player, the highest rated player at their position. Larry Ogunjobi was the highest rated interior defender by Pro Football Focus with a 94.1 overall defensive grade and a monstrous 94.6 run defensive grade, the highest of all interior defenders. You expect him to have another great game like that. You want him to come in there, be able to establish the edge, be a player that can come in, be smart along the defensive line of the ball, and just make sure that you maintain those run fits. Run fits are extremely important. Now, when you look at run fits, that's just making sure that you're staying in your lane, whatever gap you have for that particular assignment, whether it be an inside zone or outside zone or stretch play. Being able to either turn offensive lineman inside or maintain a double team block is really important because it helps your second level defenders come in to make plays. Then you also have Sheldon Richardson, who also had another strong game with a 76.8 grade. He was the 14th highest interior defender. You look at him and Larry Ogunjobi, that duo in the interior can be very strong. Now, obviously, they both have very good run defensive grades, but you're just hoping for slightly more, from a pass rush productivity from the entire defensive line. Obviously, if they're able just to get some QB pressures, cause some inaccurate throws, or maybe even just a pass deflection like we experienced multiple times last week, that can be the difference between, a third and short or a converted third down or potentially even an interception, because that pressure causes a rookie to be flustered. Now, obviously, you can expect some blitz packages from Joe Woods to take advantage of the young player on a short week, and I definitely believe that pass rushing productivity will be the difference in this game. And now you look at Jordan Elliott. Again, another player that performed well in the interior defensive line, 76.4 defensive grade, the 17th highest interior defender, again, based off his snaps. And you look at him, who had a 69.6 pass rushing grade. He was actually the highest graded SEC defender for the draft, higher than Javon Kinlaw and both Derek Brown, who went in the first round of this year's draft. You expect Jordan Elliott to come in on those passing down situations and be able to provide some pass rushing productivity. He performed well during training camp. I definitely believe he'll be able to make some plays with his style of play. And we're just expecting, players to, again, provide more along the pass rushing production along the defensive line. And you have Vincent Taylor wrapping up the rest of that interior. Now, moving on to the linebacking core. This is obviously something that's going to be a little bit, more different with the group. You look at B.J. Goodson, who's going to be that Mike linebacker in the middle of the field. He only had a 38.4 grade last week and was getting absolutely torched by the Baltimore Ravens. Mark Andrews was just seemingly always open in the middle of the field. I mean, obviously his 30.6 coverage grade for PFF, it's horrendous. Let's just keep it 100. It's not really good. So we're expecting B.J. Goodson to, play better this week. Obviously, the tight end matchups that he has against CJ Uzama is a lot better matchup versus Mark Andrews, who's obviously in the top echelon of tight ends in the NFL. And we're just hoping that he can improve. Obviously, he did perform a little bit better in run defense with a 62.7 grade. But again, we're expecting more from him in terms of his coverage and being in the middle of that field. And now you move over to Sione Takitaki, who also performed relatively decent last week with a 66.3 grade as the 15th highest rated linebacker last week. Performed relatively well, in run defense. Being that strong side backer, he's going to be someone that's going to help continue to set that edge and prevent things from going outside of the numbers and outside of the tackle box for the run game for the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, since Sione Takitaki was a player that had some questions, heading into the season, how was he going to perform having limited defensive snaps last season? But he's obviously stepped up to the challenge with injuries going in that linebacking group. So hopefully he can continue that positive play, heading into this week as a player. And as long as he can continue to play at a high level, that obviously is going to help the Browns defense having injuries along that linebacking group with Jacob Phillips and Mack Wilson also being out. Now you look at the will position. Now this comes down to Malcolm Smith as well. Malcolm Smith, another veteran offseason addition because of injury. He's not going to step in as that starting will weak side linebacker for the defense now with Mack Wilson and both Jacob Phillips being out. But you can feel confident with Malcolm Smith stepping into that role because he excels in coverage. That's one of the things that he's always been relatively good at. Last week in his 9 coverage snaps, he had an 83.7 coverage grade. Obviously, if he can help cover tight ends, help at least cover a receiver. Obviously, the Bengals are going to spread the field. And if there's a situation where they're in their base defense or obviously they're in some type of nickel package and Michael Smith is on the field, you can feel confident with him being able to cover, in the middle of the field. And again, being a short, weak veteran players that have a lot of experience in NFL, these are going to be the players that you want to rely on because these players obviously have the game day reps. They're people that can help come in, provide stability in that secondary and making sure that players aren't just running open. Obviously, that's going to be very important that Michael Smith steps up. Obviously, Mack Wilson and Jacob Phillips are both young players that the Browns defensive staff want to see flourish, but they obviously have to get healthy first. And then just wrapping up the back end of the secondary for the Browns, you look at Denzel Ward, Terrence Mitchell, and Robert Jackson as 3 players that's going to be your outside corners for the week. Denzel Ward had a relatively solid week last week. He actually had a 36.2 QBR when targeted. So a lot of times teams aren't throwing towards him because he's blanketing a lot of receivers, whether it be in man coverage or, just making smart plays, or a lot of balls are either thrown away or, thrown down towards the receiver's feet when he's in coverage. Then you look at Terrence Mitchell, who's stepping in for the injured Greedy Williams, who's out with a shoulder injury. Terrence Mitchell, another solid, cornerback. Obviously, he did get picked on a little bit last week, but that's pretty much what you expect when your third outside cornerback is moved to the starting lineup. But he's a smart player. He's feisty. He's intangible. And one thing that you want to pay attention to is that Terrence Mitchell definitely has a nose for the football. He's a player that, he can get an interception, but he has a very sneaky tactic that Joe Woods teaches to all his defensive backs, is that you want to punch the ball when you're coming for a tackle. Now, if you look at, I believe it wasn't Lamar Jackson, but it was a receiver, J.K. Dobbins. I finally came to me. J.K. Dobbins on the outside zone where he scored his second rushing touchdown for the game on the left side of the goal line. Terrence Mitchell was actually the one that was trying to stop him, but he actually went to go punch for the ball first, when he went to go for the tackle. And that's something that's going to be huge. When you have a player that's actively punching towards the football, it increases the chances of a fumble. You look at Joe Mixon, who seemingly never fumbles the football. He fumbled last week, over 600 carries without a fumble, and he fumbled one last week. This could potentially be an opportunity for, in his mind, he's thinking, I can't fumble because I already fumbled last week. Overthinking it might be a situation where the ball's too loose or you come in with a good punch. So you can look out for Terrence Mitchell potentially making a play. Now, also, you look at Tavier Thomas, who's going to be the starting nickel with Kevin Johnson also being out. He played 28 snaps last week. That's obviously the most snaps that he had since joining the team, he's more of a special teams player, but you expect him to, build upon his snaps that he had last week. Obviously, he didn't grade that well. He only had a 45.8 overall defensive grade, but you expect him to, play better in coverage. And then potentially you could see MJ Stewart, who was nursing a hamstring injury last week, to come in and to play well, for that nickelback position. Then lastly, the back end of the secondary, Carl Joseph, Ronnie Harrison, Andrew Sendejo, and Sheldrick Redwine. Carl Joseph and Andrew Sendejo both played essentially all the safety snaps there were to play for the most part last week. So you're hoping that they can continue to improve. Carl Joseph had a relatively average grade last week with a 51.8, which is 60th overall. So it's not that spectacular, but you're expecting him just to improve and be a little bit more than average. Obviously, him and Sendejo are on 1-year contracts. So this is essentially a contract year for them. If they play well, they can play themselves into a contract extension and be in Cleveland longer, which is something they want, assuming. So obviously, you're going to expect better performances out of them. And again, Andrew Sendejo, the binoculars are on you, buddy. He has to step up. Hollywood Brown, Mark Andrews, Willie Snead, pretty much anyone that was in Andrew Sendejo's area was always open. The tackling needs to improve. His coverage grade was a 37.8. Overall, he had a 30.9 overall defensive grade. You look at the failed punt fake in the first half that Kevin Stefanski had on the second drive of the game inside the own 30. Like, you get that block, it's maybe close. They might convert it, but just I feel like the lack of tenacity wasn't there for Sendejo, rather be in his tackling or just, being able to make a play on the ball. And there's going to be a more of an expectation for him to perform better. Now, given his performance last week, maybe we may see a little bit more of Sheldrick Redwine, who's actually more adept at playing in coverage. Obviously the Bengals are going to spread the field. So we're hoping that who's ever playing that free safety position can be that, security blanket on the back end and making sure that nothing's getting behind them. Now, obviously, Joe Burrow isn't Lamar Jackson, but all it takes is one miscommunication or a player being in the wrong spot in order for an offense to take advantage of that. So that's going to be the defensive depth chart and the whole Cleveland Browns depth chart for this week's matchup for Thursday Night Football. Again, my name is Shawn Stevenson, and I am the host for this week's tailgate show. And essentially every week, you guys can give me a follow at the socials in the top and right-hand corner. Again, the Cleveland Browns Tailgate Show is not affiliated directly with the Cleveland Browns or the NFL. This is strictly for Creative Commons, just to begin discussion and making sure that guys have all the information needed when it comes to the Cleveland Browns or just any matchup that they may have. And again, the Cleveland Browns Tailgate Show is sponsored by Focus Clothing CLE. Focus Clothing is a Black-owned clothing business based in Cleveland, Ohio, and no better way for us to stay focused throughout the year. And we're hoping that the Cleveland Browns can stay focused this week and get themselves a victory. So again, this is sponsored by Focus Clothing CLE. Check them out. Focus Clothing, they are more than a brand. Check out Focus Clothing at focusclothingcle.com. That's focusclothingcle.com. Now, going into the Cincinnati Bengals and their depth chart, you look at the number 1 overall pick, Joe Burrow. He's backed up by Ryan Finley. Obviously, Joe Burrow, former Ohio State Buckeye, turned to LSU Bull Tiger. And the man had an outstanding season, won the Heisman Trophy and the national championship last year. So there's obviously high expectations for him coming into the NFL. Now, last week, he did play against a tough LA Chargers defense who has a relatively solid front four with their rushing. Obviously, Melvin Ingram and Joey Bosa. And he's going to have another tough matchup with Myles Garrett and Olivier Vernon on the opposite sides of that defensive line. So Joe Burrow, it's going to be really important for him to play well this week and essentially limit turnovers. That was one of the things that he kind of struggled with last week. He had a poor pitch last week where he threw an interception in the fourth quarter when they were down. And then also you look at him just as a quarterback as a whole, but he's someone that I believe that can perform at a high level. He obviously had some struggles heading into the season last week with really just having game experience. And that's obviously something you can't get until the season started without there being a training camp. So one of the things that Joe Woods can definitely do in order to change the game speed for him is to, again, send exotic blitz packages, send 5, send 6 defenders, and just really just try to confuse him much as possible, being a rookie on a short week. But at the same time, Joe Burrow was a player that was very poised in the clutch last week. He went 8 for 11 for 70 yards, in the final drive of the game. Even threw a potential game-winning touchdown to AJ Green right on the right goal line. Unfortunately, AJ Green was called for offensive pass interference, which negated that, which went into the Randy Bullock game time missed field goal, and they lost that game to the LA Chargers. So he definitely showed that he has some poise, under pressure. And also you look at the fact that he's someone that can use his legs. That 23-yard rushing touchdown, which was smart by the fact that he audibled into it. But when he saw the opportunity, if he saw that no one was open, he had no problem, putting the ball down and then running for a few yards and then also getting down to avoid unnecessary hits. Now you also look at the running back position. You look at running back Joe Mixon, who, again, just received a 4-year contract extension this offseason. They're obviously expecting big things out of him. He had a relatively average game last week, so they're expecting more for him in terms of his production, whether that be running the ball more consistently or, catching passes out of the backfield. Now you look at Giovanni Bernard, who's going to be essentially the third down running back pass catcher. Doesn't provide a lot in terms of the running game, but he does catch passes out of the backfield. Didn't have the greatest season last year, but he's definitely a player that they'll rely on in their offensive passing sets. Then they wrap that up with Travion Williams and then Samaje Perine to wrap up their running back group. And then you have receiver AJ Green. We all know AJ Green. He's been there for a while. Again, another consistent face for the Bengals organization. Didn't play last year, obviously, from injury. And the man came back last week looking healthy. Again, almost had a game-winning touchdown reception, but again, was called for offensive pass interference. So you're going to be expecting a lot of, targets towards AJ Green. Last week had 9 targets with 6 catches. So obviously he's going to be someone that Joe Burrow, Joe Burrow is going to target on a consistent basis. Then you also have Tyler Boyd and John Ross III. These are going to be the 2 receivers that are going to be consistent on the field. The Bengals do run a lot of 11 personnel. So that's 1 running back, 1 tight end, and 3 receivers. So you can expect a heavy dose of AJ Green, Tyler Boyd, and John Ross III. And just another reminder for you, John Ross III actually was the fastest receiver in his draft class. So now if I remember correctly, he has the record for the fastest 40 of all players in the NFL Combine. And Marquise Brown, who had a bum ankle last year and gained some weight, still had 4.3 speed against the Browns last week. So if John Ross gets free out of the slot, uncontested, this is, again, going to be another matchup that you're going to watch on the back end, because Andrew Sendejo didn't relatively play well against those speed receivers, which is mostly what the Ravens receivers group is mostly speed players. But you look at John Ross, who's one of the fastest players in the NFL, to really expand the field and, get down the field as much as possible and to stretch the seams and stretch the field vertically. And then also you have Alden Tate, another big body receiver at 6'4". You have T. Higgins, receiver that they drafted this year, I believe, in the 2nd or 3rd round. And then you have Alec Erickson, who's predominantly going to be a returner for them. And then also Mike Thomas, who has some clutch catches at the end of the game against the Chargers last week. And then also you have for their tight ends, you have CJ Uzama. He's now going to be their starting tight end. Last year, they did have Tyler Eifert. Tyler Eifert was with the Bengals for a while. Obviously suffered from a lot of different injuries, whether it be a back, a shin, a knee. The man just couldn't seem to stay healthy. So obviously he's not with the Bengals anymore, but his production obviously is no longer there. And CJ Uzama is going to be the player they're expecting to step up in that role as their primary tight end. Now, again, they do run a lot of 11 personnel where there's only one tight end on the field, and also empty sets where they have 5 receivers. So there's going to be obviously times where Uzama's not on the field, and that's when they'll lean upon Drew Sample, who's more of their traditional blocking tight end, who played around 25 snaps last week. So obviously they will run some 12 personnel because obviously heavier sets make it easier, for running plays for Joe Mixon, because they're obviously going to run the ball. Having Joe Burrow on a short week, you can expect a heavy dosage of Joe Mixon, obviously, until the team falls behind, if that's to be the case. Wrapping up their offensive line, you look at Jonah Williams, a player from Alabama at the left tackle position. He had a 63.2 grade, which is the 46th graded tackle last week. You have Michael Jordan, and no, I'm not talking about the GOAT of the NBA. Michael Jordan, if you're an Ohio State Buckeyes fan, is actually going to be their left guard. He, again, graded relatively average at a 63.2 grade, again, also for the 46th rated offensive guard. And then you look at Trey Hopkins, who's going to be their starting center for this week. He also started last week in the center of that offensive line. And this is going to be the really important thing for the Cincinnati Bengals and their offensive line. You look at Billy Price. Billy Price is now stepping in for Xavier Su'a-Filo, who was the starting offensive guard last week, but he's now out and on IR for the rest of the or short-term IR currently, but he won't be playing this week. So now Billy Price is moving up to that starting offensive guard position, and he's been more of a center, in that role last year. So he's someone that moves along the interior, but there's obviously going to be a matchup to watch when Sheldon Richardson and Larry Ogunjobi go against Billy Price along that offensive line. And then lastly, you look at Bobby Hart. Bobby Hart's going to be the starting right tackle. And trust me when I say this is going to be a matchup to watch this week, tonight. You look at Bobby Hart versus Myles Garrett. Bobby Hart was getting absolutely torched by Joey Bosa last week in the first half. The offensive line for the Bengals gave up 3 sacks in the first half. So it actually shows that you can get to Joe Burrow and the quarterback and create pressure, and collapse the pocket. And Bobby Hart was one of those reasons. He struggled last week, and hopefully, with the scheme that Joe Woods is going to run this week, they can get some of that success that Joey Bosa and Melvin Ingram was able to find early in the first half. Now, obviously, they were able to settle down in the second half and keep him clean, not allowing any sacks. But it definitely showed early on in the game that Bobby Hart was struggling. And just like Joey Bosa, Myles Garrett is an outstanding pass rusher off the edge. And I definitely believe he's going to help create pressure in that offensive backfield. Now, moving over to the defensive side of the ball, they're obviously shorthanded on that defensive line. They have Carlos Dunlap and Sam Hubbard, as well as Carl Lawson. This is essentially going to be their 3 rotational defensive ends that they have. They run primarily a 4-2-6 defensive scheme. Essentially with that, they run more defensive backs than they have linebackers on the field. So you can expect Carlos Dunlap, Sam Hubbard, and Carl Lawson to be on the field a lot. You actually look at Sam Hubbard, who was their second highest rated defensive lineman. He was the highest rated edge player last week, was a 73.9, which is 20th for defensive ends and edge players last week. And he had a really strong run grade with an 81.3. So obviously he was someone that was helping set the edge. And that's going to be very important for either Jack Conklin or Jedrick Wills, whoever he matches up against this week, that they're able to, win that matchup, because he did perform relatively well last week in run defense. And then also with Carl Lawson, he's going to be more of that pass rushing rotational defensive end for that defense. Now, looking at the interior of the defensive line, this is going to be someone or position group, that you're going to want to watch for this week. because again, they're missing Geno Atkins and Mike Daniels. The two starters, essentially the best players that they have for the defensive line group. They're now going to be looking at DJ Reader and Christian Covington to step up in that role and perform along that interior defensive line. You look at DJ Reader, who performed relatively well as an interior defender. He's going to be their nose tackle. He graded at 76.8, which is 14th highest for interior defenders. He had a very good rush grade last week with an 83.5, which is second highest for all interior defenders, only behind Larry Ogunjobi. So obviously he's a player that performed well when he was with the Texans, and now he's with the Bengals, and he's going to provide some great run defense. And obviously he's a big body, being that nose tackle, who's going to be someone that eats up blocks. He's going to command the double team, and it's going to be very important that obviously J.C. Treader, Wyatt Teller, and Joe Bitonio will be able to communicate to obviously win at the point of attack and prevent him from plugging up too much, where they're able to make that initial double team block and then have a player get to the second level and grab one of those linebackers. Then you look at Christian Covington, who's now going to be stepping in from that rotational defensive tackle role now into the starting defensive tackle role with Geno Atkins out. Last week, he graded relatively decent with a 64.0, which was the 43rd highest for defensive interior players. More of a run defensive player than pass rush potential and productivity. But again, now forced into a more important role, being forced into that starting defensive line group. He's also backed up by Amani Bledsoe and Andrew Brown, going to be some players that's going to get additional snaps this week as well. Now going to the linebacker group, this is going to be a little bit different. You look at the league, it is more of a passing league. And again, just with their linebacking group being so young in the depth chart, I don't see them going to their base defense, which is going to be a 4-3 too often, but obviously it's still going to happen. You look at their starting group, which is going to be your Mike, which is Josh Bynes. He was their highest graded linebacker last week with a 62 grade, and he was the 21st graded linebacker last week. Played a little bit better in coverage with a 67.3 grade. He's someone that is relatively average in run defense, but it's a little bit better at covering the middle of the field. So obviously he's going to be matched up against Harrison Bryant and Austin Hooper and looking to make plays against them. Then you go to Logan Wilson, a rookie out of Wyoming, who's also going to play that Mike linebacker, someone that played relatively decent last week, but again, just young, prone to mistakes is something that you're going to expect from rookies, again, with a shortened offseason training camp and no OTAs. So obviously there's going to be some limited snaps for Logan Wilson, and then he's back to Marcus Bailey. Then you go over to the wheel possession, which is essentially that weak side, but it's more of a left middle linebacker with Jermaine Pratt, who graded relatively poor last week. He was graded at a 45.1, which was the 49th lowest grade. And his run defense was porous last week at 37.2 run defensive grade by Pro Football Focus. So you can definitely expect, a lot of runs to be going that direction. But again, if Joe Bitonio or Wyatt Teller can get into open space to the second level, he didn't perform relatively well. Neither of them, performed really above average at all last week in run defense. So if those offensive linemen for the Browns can get to the second level, expect some big runs by Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. Now going to their defensive back group, you look at William Jackson III and Darius Phillips. Those are going to be your outside corners for the week. William Jackson graded at 64.2, which was the 32nd highest for cornerbacks last week. And then Darius Phillips, who graded relatively average as well at 52.3, but he was on the lower end with a 72nd ranked cornerback. William Jackson out of Houston. I mean, he's a man coverage corner, but doesn't really offer anything spectacular in terms of what he does for the defense. Obviously, Jarvis Landry and Odell Beckham Jr. are very talented receivers, and you expect a lot of them. But on the flip side, you look at Mackenzie Alexander, who's actually one of the better nickel backs in the league. He's going to be facing against Jarvis Landry a lot this game. So obviously that's going to be another matchup to watch. Mackenzie Alexander obviously is no slouch. He had a 73.2 grade, which is 14th highest for cornerbacks last week, and he had an 80.3 coverage grade. In man coverage, he plays relatively well in that spot. He's very agile, plays well in man coverage, also adept in zone coverage underneath as well. So him versus Jarvis Landry is going to be a consistent matchup. Obviously, if Jarvis Landry doesn't have a huge game, you can accredit that a lot to Mackenzie Alexander. But again, if Landry is able to, find spaces, he's still going to make some plays just because he's been that consistent player and has always been able to do so. And then you wrap up their secondary with Von Bell, who's going to be more of your traditional in the box safety. He comes down and run support, graded at 64 overall, so just slightly average last week with the 29th rated safety out of 64. And then he had, again, just a more adept run defensive grade with a 68.7. Now you look at the free safety position. Jesse Bates III, the man played out of his mind last week. A 91.6 grade for the highest of all safeties last week. A 89.9 coverage grade. So obviously pass defenses, coming down in run support, being able to knock down the ball at the point of attack or the point of catch. Jesse Bates was really the tempo setter for that Bengals defense last week, and they're going to expect him to do so again this week. Obviously being, coming into his third year, this is a big year for him because he has the potential to get another contract extension next offseason. So he's somewhat playing in a contract year because he's going to be going into his fourth year next season. So obviously he's going to want to play well. He's going to be that tone setter. And if he's that player that can come down, make some big hits, knock down some balls, obviously, God forbid, an interception, he's going to be that player that a lot of that Bengals defense rallies around, especially in that secondary. So I can definitely say that the secondary is the strong point of this Bengals defense. So you're going to be looking at Baker Mayfield to really trust what he's seeing in terms of the scheme. If he can really find that open man down the field, be able to deliver an accurate pass, that can really be the difference between the Browns, winning this game and them not performing that well. So again, that's going to be the Cincinnati Bengals depth chart. You look at the schemes, and again, for me, team versus scheme, I got to go ahead and find it. Sorry, I had a little bit of a issue with the overlays this week. Come on, team schemes. Nope. Last week, I got to fix a couple of these last week. My apologies. Just had some issues with the stream this week in terms of the overlays. Again, just something that we'll be able to fix. But again, we're going to be here all 16 games. So, of course, some hiccups are going to happen. You look at the Browns games last week, there were plenty of hiccups. And, if I call for something, it ain't COVID. Your boy just trying to talk to y'all. So, but let's go ahead and just get into the Cleveland Browns schemes. And we'll just make sure that we're more organized. Again, next week we'll have plenty of time. Again, just on the short week, obviously just a lot of things going on with the stream. But you look at the Cleveland Browns schemes, again, offense. They're looking to run that outside zone as much as possible. It's something that they were relatively adept at last week, running that 12 personnel, essentially with 2 tight ends. So you can expect more of a dose of Austin Hooper as well as Harrison Bryant, trying to establish the run as much as possible with Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. Going to their defensive scheme, Joe Woods is going to be running that 4-3 under. You expect him to come in and be able to get some pressure on the quarterback. I'm expecting a lot more blitzes this week. Obviously, he did try to send some more heat on Lamar Jackson, was able to get to him, or by the time the rush was able to get there, the ball was already out. But just, again, understanding that Joe Burrow is a young player, this may cause him to hold the ball, which could either result in him throwing a pass late, which could result in an interception, or obviously he will have to hold the ball and just take a sack. So hopefully, this defensive scheme this week will be a lot more aggressive in terms of what Joe Woods wants to install. And then you look at the Cincinnati Bengals on the opposite end. Obviously, they're looking to run a spread offense. Now, a spread offense is going to be very similar to what Joe Burrow ran at LSU. And, I applaud the second-year head coach, Zach Taylor, for this offensive scheme that he does run, because he understands the best way for your rookie to feel comfortable is to run something similar to what he ran in college, obviously being with the shortened offseason. So you're going to expect a lot of 11 personnel, a lot of 3 receivers, 4 receivers. And I wouldn't be surprised if this week they run more empty sets than they did last week. Obviously, Joe Mixon didn't have the greatest game. He only averaged 3.9 yards per carry last week. So they're expecting a little bit more from him on the ground game. They did give him 19 carries, so he's probably still going to be around that range. They want him around 20 carries a week, but I still expect most of this game to be on the arm of Joe Burrow. And with that, if they spread the field, a lot of this is going to be, again, on the Cleveland Browns secondary. So when we look at some matchups to watch this week, one thing I definitely expect a big game from is the Browns offensive line versus the Bengals defensive line. Obviously, the Bengals defensive line is suffering from some injuries this week, and you want them to, the Browns offensive line to perform well. You look at Wyatt Teller, again, the highest graded offensive guard last week. J.C. Treader and Joe Batoni performing well in that interior. And then you just expect, better performances from Jedrick Wills and Jack Conklin over at those tackle spots. If they're able to control the trenches and really maintain the point of attack, we could expect some big runs from Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, who had relatively decent games against the Baltimore Ravens, who have some pretty good players at their defensive line with Calais Campbell and Derek Wolfe and Brandon Williams. They were able to find some success last week, and obviously you would want them to continue that success this week going against the Bengals. Now you look at another matchup. I think arguably for the defense, any single two players besides he who shall not be named, not Voldemort, but Myles Garrett versus right tackle Bobby Hart. Bobby Hart was getting manhandled against Joey Bosa at the beginning of the game. Obviously, he did find some more consistency. But Myles Garrett, you being the anchor of that defensive line, honestly, the anchor of that whole Browns defense, this is the week for you to come out and make some plays. If you can come out and get a sack, get consistent QB pressures, even some QB knockdowns. I don't feel like we saw many QB knockdowns or really much, pass rushing pressure. Obviously, there were some plays where he caused Lamar Jackson to get out of the pocket, but we want to see him finish some plays. Obviously, a QB knockdown isn't a play where it causes, incompletion or anything like that, but it is a stat that is recognized because it's important. And the more a quarterback is being hit, the less like he wants to stay in there and stay in the pocket. Or, he might get a little antsy. And sometimes when that player is getting antsy in the pocket, that can cause him either throw a pass too soon or too late. And Myles Garrett really is going to be that player, I believe, this week. And that matchup against Bobby Hart is something he has to take advantage of. You're a great player, but again, we just want to see that game-breaking potential that we know he has. And then lastly, you look at the Browns safeties versus the Bengals receivers. I probably sound like a broken record, but again, they're going to spread the field, and they're going to have multiple receivers, 3 minimum majority of the game on the field. John Ross can extend the field vertically. AJ Green extend the field vertically. Alden Tate, 6'4", can catch the ball outside of the numbers. Carl Joseph, Andrew Sendejo, Sheldrick Redwine, who I believe is going to get some more reps this week. It's really on them to prevent any of the deep balls. Andrew Sendejo, I don't like to be that person that comes out to specifically target a player, but a lot of eyes are on Andrew Sendejo this week. If he can't be that security blanket in the back end of that secondary, you can expect Sheldrick Redwine to be getting more snaps. Because obviously at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how many years of experience you have in NFL. It all comes down to performance. And the performance that he put last week just wasn't that great. So obviously we're expecting more from him, and for him to step up. If he can do that, I do believe, the Browns safeties will have a better performance than they did last week, but it all comes down to just making the smart plays. Now, again, the Cleveland Browns Tailgate Show is hosted by the Cleveland Browns Digest, which is a Sports Illustrated NFL website. You can check us out at si.com/NFL/Browns. It is led by lead editor Pete Smith. You can follow him on Instagram, on Twitter @_Pete Smith _. Great articles, daily articles every day. Also, you can check out Brandon Little as well. He's another contributing writer for Browns Digest over on Sports Illustrated. Make sure you guys give the accounts a follow. Again, you're going to get daily articles from us, whether it be about different information about where you can catch and watch the Browns games, fantasy outlooks from Brandon Little, different columns talking about contributions that you can expect from Browns players, or even about the matchups. Pete offers a lot of articles that breaks down the Browns in a very in-depth manner. And again, myself, I have weekly columns, and again, providing the Cleveland Browns Tailgate Show on a weekly basis for fans this week with the Tailgate Show. So make sure you guys go ahead and give it a follow for the social media accounts. And again, you also can find them on my social media as well. I retweet the articles all the time, so you guys can check them out that way. Now, going back to the groups, it's really important this week that the Browns perform. Obviously, the schemes, the Cleveland Browns have a scheme that's adept in running the ball. And Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt are going to be the game plan for this week. And when it comes down to it, those are players that you expect them to perform. You look at Nick Chubb last week, he had 10 carries for 60 yards with a 6 yards per carry average. You're expecting more carries from him. Obviously, they divvied up the carries. Nick Chubb had 10, Kareem Hunt had 13. I'm expecting more carries. Obviously, both of them being in double digits is important, but Nick Chubb is the bell cow of this offense. You look at what Kevin Stefanski had in Minnesota with Dalvin Cook. They were running the ball early and often. So that same expectation should continue with Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. Last week, Nick Chubb graded with a 60.2 overall for the 29th rated running back. Obviously, we're expecting more from him in terms of rushing productivity. And then Kareem Hunt, 13 carries last week for 72 yards with 5.5 yards per carry average. He had a 64.4 overall grade, and he was his 22nd highest rated running back last week. And he obviously provides a lot in terms of the receiving game as well, catching passes out of the backfield. Now you compare them to Joe Mixon, who had a 19 carries for 69 yards and a 3.6 yard carry per average. You look at, this is killing me with the, here we go. Sorry, just the overlays are so unorganized this week. You look at Joe Mixon and Giovanni Bernard, where Joe Mixon had a 3.6 yards carry per average last week, which isn't spectacular. So obviously his rushing grade wasn't the greatest last week, being the 38th graded running back. And you look at Giovanni Bernard, who's always been more of a pass catching back out of the backfield for the Bengals. Obviously, he's a little bit more depth at receiving. Had a 68.9 receiving grade last week, for 13th out of all running backs. But he doesn't get a lot of snaps at the running back position. Really, Joe Mixon is more of the bell cow for them. So for me, this is obviously an easy comparison of who you will want for the running backs. Easily. You look at Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. The Browns have the best running back group, and that's something that you're going to continue to see with them being the basis of that offensive game. Now, you look at the wide receivers. You have Odell Beckham Jr., Jarvis Landry. You have Kadero Hodge, Rashard Higgins. These are some great players. Obviously, Odell didn't have the greatest week last week. On 10 targets, he only had 3 receptions for 22 yards. That simply isn't going to cut it. He has to step his game up. Jarvis Landry caught 5 of his 6 targets for 61 yards last week. Again, just being a consistent player in the intermediate parts in the middle part of the field. The more that Baker Mayfield can find them consistently, you can expect, more production from the wide receiver group. But this might be disappointing for some people, but this is something that I'm going to give personally to the Cincinnati Bengals. You look at AJ Green, you look at Tyler Boyd. You look at John Ross, Alden Tate. They have receivers that they can consistently rely on, and obviously I'm going to give the edge to them by the fact that they run 11 personnel and they have more emphasis on the receivers, and also just given the matchup. You look at AJ Green, had 9 targets, 5 receptions for 51 yards last week. Obviously, those aren't gaudy numbers, but we all know what AJ Green is capable of. He's beat the Browns numerous times throughout the matchups that he's had, throughout the years. So he obviously knows how to find success against the Browns secondary. You look at Tyler Boyd. Tyler Boyd had over 1,000 yards last season receiving. Now he is more of a traditional possession receiver, but he broke Larry Fitzgerald's reception records back in college. So obviously, you know that he's a player that can catch a lot of passes and be a consistent target. He had 4 receptions, 45 yards last week. Again, these aren't gaudy numbers, but they show last week that they have a chemistry. And talent-wise, I do believe Odell Beckham Jr. and Jarvis Landry is better talently, but chemistry in the NFL is very important. You look at the chemistry that AJ Green and Tyler Boyd have with Joe Burrow, it's a lot more fluid than what Baker Mayfield has thus far. Now, this game could be a turning point for the chemistry with Odell Beckham Jr. and Jarvis Landry, but obviously you're just hoping that, they can pick that up and be able to, perform at a higher level. Now, also going back to the tight ends, you look at Austin Hooper and you look at Harrison Bryant. Austin Hooper last week had 2 receptions for 15 yards, 2 targets. Again, 15 yards isn't enough. 2 targets isn't a lot. You expect him obviously to have more production, but Baker Mayfield has to get him the ball. Harrison Bryant obviously is going to have more opportunities to step up this week, but this is obviously an easy comparison when you compare them to CJ Uzomah and Chris Sample, who aren't really, the world's greatest tight ends. Obviously, them running 11 personnel for the Bengals, it's something that the Browns will be able to excel in and just be more adept by the fact that they can play 2 tight end sets confidently. Also, with Austin Hooper, now he didn't provide a lot in terms of receiving last week, but he had an 83.0 run blocking grade, which was 4th highest for all tight ends last week. You expect him to continue that success and be able to be another strong blocker as that inline tight end. Now, I do respect him for what he provided in the run game, and you expect him to continue that success this week. Now, moving over to the offensive line for the Browns, you look at Jack Conklin and Jedrick Wills. These are 2 players that were suffering from injuries last week, but obviously, they can provide more being healthy. I'm expecting potentially maybe a better game in terms of the run blocking grade for Jedrick Wills and Jack Conklin on the edge. I mean, we run an outside zone, so you're going to expect a little bit more from them. But the interior of the offensive line has been solid. You look at Wyatt Teller, again, had the highest grade of all interior offensive linemen with a 91.2, had an outstanding run blocking grade with a 91.6, the second highest of all guards. You want to continue to see that growth from him. J.C. Treader, again, questionable with a knee injury, but he's another player that I expect to play and to be, that voice in the middle, being able to communicate and develop chemistry to provide another clean pocket for Baker Mayfield. And then obviously you have Joe Bitonio, another staple for the offensive line. And for me, this is going to be just another easy comparison for the groups when you look at who they have for the Bengals and their offensive line. You look at Jonah Williams, Mike Jordan, Trey Hopkins, Billy Price, and Bobby Hart. Obviously, there's going to be some times where Joe Burrow's running for his life just because they don't really have much at all in terms of up front. It's hard to really find a lot of positive of what they offer because their performance along the offensive line is relatively average when you look at what they perform. Like Bobby Hart's pass blocking grade, it's something that obviously doesn't provide a lot of confidence. Billy Price, he wasn't their number 1 right guard heading into training camp. So you're going to expect him to struggle slightly as the team tries to get more chemistry. And again, they're running on a short week. Now, the left side of that offensive line, where you're going to see more Sheldon Richardson and Olivier Vernon, Jonah Williams, Mike Jordan, Trey Hopkins, those are going to be the players I expect to be a little bit more consistent. But that right side of the offensive line most likely is going to struggle. So I'm definitely going to give this to the Cleveland Browns and their offensive line. So one of the biggest things when it comes down to what the Browns can do to be successful this week is making sure they're running the ball. But before we get to the key of them running the ball, let's run over and let you guys know again who the sponsor is for the Cleveland Browns Tailgate Show, which is Focus Clothing, CLE. Focus Clothing, they are more than a brand. You can check them out at www.focusclothingcle.com. That's focusclothingcle.com.
Who said that t-shirt was only for the summer?
Again, Focus Clothing, wonderful, wonderful brand. You can check them out. A Cleveland-owned business here, Black-owned business. Can't beat that. Going definitely with the times. Check out Focus Clothing. Again, great apparel, T-shirts, hats, hoodies. Check them out. Now, going back to the rest of the defensive group comparisons, we're going to go into the linebackers. Now, this week, again, it's going to be a little bit different with Jacob Phillips and Mack Wilson being out with knee injuries. You're going to expect Malcolm Smith to step up. Now, you look at B.J. Goodson and Sione Takitaki. Those are two players that are going to be really those two middle linebackers, two linebackers that's going to be on the field for majority of the snaps. But also believe that Malcolm Smith can come in and provide, good reps, in coverage on third down situations when he's on the field, rather if you want to take out B.J. Goodson or Takitaki. But those are two players that I definitely believe will come in and provide solid play for them. Then you look at the Bengals and their linebacking group. There's not really anything to write home with. If I can find the group, come on. So, again, just another one that I missed. Apologies again. Just having a lot of stream errors this week with the overlays. Be a lot more organized next week. You look at who they have for their group, and they just don't offer a lot in terms of their linebacking core. You look at Jermaine Pratt and you look at Josh Bynes, and those are players that I really feel like you can take advantage of, in pass and run defense and running the ball. Obviously, that's going to be the Browns' primary objective, is running the ball at a high level this week. And then if they can do that with success, I definitely believe, they could take advantage of that, Bengals linebacking core. So again, I'm going to have to give this advantage to the Browns for their linebacking group. Now you look at the defensive line. This one for me, obviously, is another easy answer. You look at Myles Garrett, Olivier Vernon, Sheldon Richardson, Larry Ogunjobi. These are players that we expect to perform well. They're going against a relatively weak Cincinnati Bengals offensive line. And then you look at the Cincinnati Bengals and their defensive line. They're riddled with injuries. You look at DJ Reader and Christian Covington as two players that are now going to have, majority of the snaps at that interior of the defensive line, because you don't have Geno Atkins and Mike Daniels. So again, running the ball is going to be really big this week. And I just don't believe they have enough depth or enough talent along the interior of that defensive line to stop the Browns' run game. Then also you have the edge players of Carlos Dunlap and Sam Hubbard. But again, just their talent doesn't equate to what the Browns offer along the defensive line. And again, just another group that I believe excels over what the Browns have to offer. So now you look at the cornerbacks. This one is not a group that I can really give to the Browns. Obviously, one, you look at injury. No Greedy Williams, no Kevin Johnson. MJ Stewart was just nursing a hamstring injury last week. And then you have Denzel Ward and Terrence Mitchell as your starting two, but you're missing a lot of your secondary. Tavier Thomas played the most snaps he's ever played in his career in week one, and he's, again, going to be that starting nickelback this week. You look at Robert Jackson and MJ Stewart. Those are going to be players that, haven't had a lot of game day reps at the nickelback or just outside corner positions, and they're going to be leaned on heavily, versus the Cincinnati Bengals, on the other hand, who have performed relatively well. You look at Mackenzie Alexander, a player that has, played well in the slot. You look at William Jackson III, again, not the greatest wow of a player, but he's solid. He's consistent. Darius Phillips is just another player. I mean, he's average, but I feel like they know what to expect from them, and they're not suffering from injuries. Your starting defensive backs may not be the greatest talents in the world, but you're not looking at your third corner or your fourth corner or your fifth corner to be serious contributors this week. So I'm going to have to give it to the Cincinnati Bengals in terms of the secondary for this matchup. Then you go over to the safeties as well. Safeties is going to be huge for this week. Again, just the secondary for the Browns is not a group that you can feel confident in, based off their performance off of last week, because you have to go based off of what have you done for me lately. And Andrew Sendejo hasn't really done much for you lately. Carl Joseph is going to be more of your traditional box safety, but you're expecting more from them in the secondary, being those safeties, this week. But again, you look at what the Cincinnati Bengals have in that secondary, and you have Von Mel, who doesn't really do well in coverage. He's relatively below average, but he's great in run defense. And, that's what he sells in, being a box safety. And like I said, Jesse Bates III, he's going to be the heartbeat of that Cincinnati Bengals defense, being that free safety. He performed extremely well last week, had a 91.6 overall defensive grade and an 89.99 coverage grade. He's playing well. Obviously, those are two players that what their roles are. They're excelling in those roles. And just Andrew Sendejo didn't perform well. Carl Joseph, you're expecting a little bit more from him. So I'm going to have to give, again, the safety groups to the Cincinnati Bengals. And then lastly, you look at special teams. This one was another discussion this week. Obviously, the Cleveland Browns released Austin Seibert after missing an extra point in a field goal last week versus the Ravens, and they promoted Cody Parkey from the practice squad to the active roster. He's not going to be kicking this week. You look at Jamie Gillen, again, another player that performed well, and I'm expecting him to be another consistent player. If he's able to grow, he could be a player that could, again, win Special Teams Player of the Week or Special Teams Player of the Month, similar to what he did last season. He has an amazing leg. Again, left-footed punters are very advantageous in the NFL for what they offer because of how the ball, breaks differently versus a right-footed punter. So I definitely believe that, the Browns do have a good special teams unit. Obviously, there's still some questions about Cody Parkey being the kicker. But on the same token, you look at what the Cincinnati Bengals have. Randy Bullock, who was nursing a calf injury, he was listed as questionable, but for a good portion of the week, they actually ended up claiming Austin Seibert off the waiver wire last week, and a lot of people are expecting him to kick this week for tonight's matchup. But Randy Bullock says he's good to go. He obviously missed a game-winning field goal and pulled his calf last week, so the health of that calf could make a difference. What if he misses a couple kicks and it's a close game? Does Austin Seibert come in? If he's active this week, to kick, rather be on kickoffs or just kicking field goals. That's absolutely something we have to look out for. And I know there was a lot of Browns fans talking this week. What are the chances? And it's a close game-winning situation. Austin Seibert trots on the field and then kicks a game-winning field goal for the Bengals. That obviously would be a nightmarish scenario given what Seibert did last week. But this game, I believe, if the Browns are able to run their game plan and create pressure on Joe Burrow and just limit what they can do for the Bengals offense, this shouldn't be a close game because the Browns should dominate the time of possession, run the ball, and score. So it's really big this week that the Browns, step up and really show, what they have as a team. Now, the three keys to winning this game, Mark, this goes back to your question, asking what is the key? You've heard it throughout the show. Run the ball. Pound the rock. There's no reason this week why Nick Chubb shouldn't have 20 carries. I wouldn't be surprised if Kareem Hunt has 15. There should be at least a minimum of 30 carries this week. I don't care who it comes from. Obviously, I do care, but Nick Chubb should be the bell cow this week, and they have to run the ball. No Mike Daniels, no Geno Atkins. Running the ball is very, very important this week, and I expect Kevin Stefanski to call plenty of runs. And this leads to the next key to running the game. Utilize play action on the offense. When you run up the ball, running the ball sets up play action. When you set up play action, what does that do? It helps set up the pass. All offseason, Kevin Stefanski has talked about the marriage of the run and pass. When you can make the pass look like the run, play actions are more effective. Getting players open down the field. I believe this week is very important for the Browns in establishing the run and getting the play action down. Now, again, I know a lot of times you don't see all three keys of winning the game being for the offense, but if the defense is just able to cause some disruption, the third thing is sticking to the game plan. This is the third key, and obviously one of the most important keys outside of the first one, which is running the ball. Stick to the game plan. Last week, they were force-feeding the ball to Odell, and obviously since last season, it hasn't worked. Part of being a coach is developing a game plan, sticking to the game plan, and if you believe the game plan works, you should be winning. I mean, it's very simple. Obviously, the Browns have the better team with talent overall across the roster. Now it comes to the scheme. Odell Beckham Jr. does not have to be the game plan. He's a part of the game plan. And if we can stick to that, play action, running the ball, controlling the time of possession, that will work. The game plan this week, stick to the game plan, control the time of possession, and those are the three keys the Browns have to stick to in order to win this game. So again, I want to thank you guys so much for coming out this week. And kickoff is going to be in 20 minutes. This obviously was a lot different show. We had some more hiccups in terms of overlays this week. But again, next week, make sure you guys come out. We're going to be playing against the Washington Redskins next Sunday. So obviously, going to have everything down packed. We did have some improvements this week for the tailgate recipe of the week was ultimate fudge brownies. You guys were able to enjoy that at its full capacity. So make sure, again, you can find the full recipe on Facebook and Twitter as well for the ultimate fudge brownies during halftime on the Cleveland Browns Digest website as well. Again, my name is Shawn Stevenson. And lastly, you got to make sure that we talk about what my final score prediction is. I believe this one should be an easy game for the Browns. 28-10, simple score prediction. Just run the ball, control the clock. And I definitely believe this is going to be a great game for the Browns. If you guys do have any questions, feel free to tweet me during the game. I'll obviously be giving my thoughts. I love joking around with people. There's going to be a game thread also on the Sports Illustrated Browns Digest website. Again, that's www.si.com/NFL/Browns. Check out the live thread. It'll be updated throughout the game by Pete Smith. And again, at halftime, you can check out the recipe if you don't go on the Facebook or Twitter, during the game. You can also check out the tailgate recipe of the week on the Browns website for Browns Digest. So again, thank you guys so much for coming out this week. If you have any questions, feel free to, again, tweet me. We do have one question from Clout Guy Too Nice. He asked, what time does the game start exactly on the West Coast? The game's going to be starting at 5:20. So I actually never talked about this, so this is just a little bit last thing about me. I actually went to school in California. I graduated from San Francisco State University with my bachelor's in broadcasting, electronic communication arts. So you can definitely expect a lot more in terms of streams and productivity and presentation. So anything when it comes to the West Coast or different just time zones, I can answer those questions for you. But again, 5:20 will be the game for you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed the stream. Again, hit me up on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I do follow back. And then make sure you guys do go ahead and check out Browns Digest of Sports Illustrated. And I'll catch you at the stream. Go Browns.